Europe has never engaged in launching a search and rescue mission, so a mission at sea with an explicit search and rescue mandate. And I think this is a real pity because in a context where you have systematic presence of people in distress at sea, you need to make sure that no one is abandoned there, that no one is left to die.
The Mediterranean Sea is one of the most dangerous and unpredictable routes used by migrants seeking a chance for a new life in Europe. For years, Europe has been celebrated as a defender of human rights, yet the very policies it implements on migration often contradict its values, leaving asylum seekers in a web of violence, trauma, and neglect.
The 2023 was the deadliest
La
year
route
for
migratoire
migrants.
la plus meurtrière au monde a fait de nouvelles victimes.
Hundreds on board, hundreds of migrants missing. It's believed of 700 people were on board seeking
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our podcast. We are
Sana,
Matilde,
Giovanna,
and Rachel, master students at the Geneva Graduate Institute. In this podcast, Out of Sight, Out of Rights, Human Rights and EU Migration Policy in the Mediterranean Sea, we'll discuss one of Europe's most pressing crises, this journey of migration through the Mediterranean, exploring the political and legal challenges and the critical role of humanitarian assistance. Today, we'll be joined by a special guest, Ms. Giorgia Lenardi. Ms. Lenardi is a spokesperson of the rescue NGO Sea-Watch. In the span of 10 years, she moved from a volunteer as a legal advisor to strategic and operational advisor, now representing the institution. She's taken part in several search and rescue missions in the Mediterranean and Aegean Seas, as well as aerial monitoring operations. She's also led MSF's Humanitarian Affairs Department, focusing on migrants' detention centers and community support in Libya. To understand this crisis, we first need to understand the journey. Why are so many people risking everything to cross the Mediterranean?
In 2023, more than 1.2 million people applied for asylum in the European Union. Of these people, over 280,000 departed from North Africa. This number grew 58% from the previous year and is only expected to increase. These individuals are often constrained by limited legal pathways and by strict, sometimes discriminatory border policies. Nonetheless, they still turn to risky sea routes, hoping to reach European soil and to seek asylum.
Many listeners might be familiar with the reason why people would want to leave a country. This includes push factors like war, conflict, or persecution based on race, gender, political opinion, or social group. But what we are all less aware of is what precisely happens at sea.
Exactly. Once at sea, people seeking asylum are essentially out of sight and out of rights. Their journey entails crossing the Mediterranean in dangerous waters, on overcrowded boats, all with a profound uncertainty about their safety and future. And in the past decade, experts estimated that more than 30,000 migrants lost their lives at sea, mostly due to drowning, lack of food, water, shelter, and generally unsafe conditions.
And how do European policies respond to these needs?
It's a nuanced question, in fact, because many policies have hidden motives that are not immediately clear. For example, international law guarantees that migrants cannot be returned to countries where they face torture or persecution. This principle is called non-refoulement and is guaranteed by Article 33 of the 1951 Refugee Convention.
Right, but unfortunately it's not that simple. In practice, European policies often sidestep these obligations. And how do they do this? By preventing migrants from reaching their soil in the first place, basically evading any responsibility for their care.
This is unfortunately common, and we can see this through changes in the law. Over the years, the principle of non-refoulement has been upheld through commitments in international and EU law.
The most recent example is from June 2024, when the new EU Pact on Migration and Asylum was approved. In theory, this pact aims to promote European border security, increase solidarity among EU states, and manage incoming asylum seekers. EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen describes this pact in a press statement.
This package reflects a fair and reasonable balance between responsibility and solidarity among member states. We all share the benefits. We all share the burden.
The response to this pact has been divisive, to say the least. Far-right parties have denounced the pact for being too lenient and discouraging migration. But on the opposing side, humanitarian organizations say it goes too far.
In fact, over 50 NGOs stated their concerns in an open letter to the EU, declaring the pact would normalize immigration detention, even for young children and families, increase racial profiling, and send people to third countries where they are likely to be abused, tortured, and imprisoned. They stressed, human rights cannot be compromised.
So now the real question is whether EU countries will use this power in a human and responsible way, or if they will continue to fuel an already harmful system.
How are migrants kept out of sight and therefore out of rights? The EU has created a system to keep them far from member states' borders, often in dangerous and abusive conditions. This strategy is known as externalization and raises serious concerns about accountability and human rights. Ms. Leonardi explains this further.
The direction taken by the European Union and member states have been to rather delegate responsibility over rescuing people to the other side, to North African countries, namely Libya, Tunisia, but also Egypt now. These policies are called externalization policies, but what does that mean is that basically is the attempt to delegate responsibilities to those countries so that there is basically no contact, no physical contact made between European authorities and people on the move, because by that contact come duties and responsibilities.
Many states refuse to engage directly with migrants at sea through claims of extraterritoriality, arguing that human rights obligations don't apply beyond their borders. Yet, in the case of Horikawa versus Italy, the European Court of Human Rights ruled that interception is an exercise of extraterritorial jurisdiction.
Yes, this is a landmark case because it tackled extraterritoriality. The court ruled that Italy violated the principle of non-refoulement, while Italy argued that their vessels were in international waters for search and rescue. But the court clarified, under international law, a state has full jurisdiction over ships flying its flag, meaning human rights must be upheld as if passengers were on Italian soil. Still, many states continue to exploit extraterritoriality and externalization to dodge asylum responsibilities, keeping migrants out of sight.
Frontex, the European Border and Coast Guard Agency, was created to ensure border safety and control. It is also tasked with search and rescue or SAR operations. But how does it act in practice? It actually often prioritizes border enforcement and pushbacks rather than saving lives at sea. It operates under an ambiguous and vague legal framework, which it exploits to avoid the principle of non-refoulement.
Exactly. Because it operates out of sight, shielded by the sea, Frontex acts without witnesses. Migrants are returned to their country of departure, where they risk suffering severe human rights violations under the guise of administrative detention.
Ms. Leonardi critiques this cycle of abuse that the European Union calls a global approach to migration, but in reality only promotes its close collaboration with third countries.
If you are taken on board a vessel from the Libyan authorities and brought back to Libya, which is a country that is internationally recognized as a non-safe country, where you will be again subject to arbitrary detention and abuse and likely again violently extorted by traffickers, and then eventually find yourself at sea again. That is a system that is being used by Europe to circumvent its responsibilities and avoid that contact. At the same time, I find it as absolutely not a way to manage the phenomenon of migration, because you're actually fueling a cycle of abuse where people are sent back and then potentially find themselves back at sea. So I don't see really a solution in this approach, and rather a way to avoid responsibility and to contain migration.
Since the 2015 refugee crisis, NGOs like Sea-Watch have been taking the lead in search and rescue in the Mediterranean, filling in the gaps amidst the EU's exclusionary practices. They focus on saving migrants' lives over strict border control policies, which Ms. Leonardi explains further.
In the moment you find yourself at sea at the risk of drowning, you are a human being and a bearer of rights. But what is the chance that you have to enjoy those rights? You need someone to come and rescue you. For you to be able to be safe, right to life, seek protection, right to asylum, and through the right to seek asylum in a third country, have access to the whole other spectrum of rights. So you need someone to come and get you and rescue you in order to have access to your rights.
But NGO responses haven't come without backlash. Far-right politicians accuse them of enabling migration and even blame NGOs for encouraging more migrants to come.
And since 2017, governments have tightened the screws, introducing legal restrictions against SAR operations and criminalizing many of their efforts. This has sparked much criticism for undermining humanitarian principles and endangering countless lives. Legal crackdowns on migrants themselves, particularly of boat drivers, have also seen a dramatic increase.
A way in which Europe and Italy in particular is fighting human trafficking is by systematically arresting boat drivers upon arrivals. There have been over 3,200 people arrested since 2013, and in most cases it is documented and proven that these people are driving the boat out of necessity or even in some cases out of constriction. I think it's very problematic to see how thousands of people's lives are being literally broken by arbitrary arrest, and then how that is depicted as the way to fight human trafficking, while our policies are actually fueling human trafficking by allowing that people intercepted at sea by North African coast guards are sent back, pushed back, committing a violation of international law.
In a recent interview with Propaganda Live on La Sette, an Italian television broadcast, Miss Linardi also stated,
È assolutamente vero
It is
che
absolutely true
le persone
that
che guidano
people
le barche
who drive the boats are, in most cases, not human traffickers. But just think about it logically. If you were running a business worth an unknown amount of money, involving an unknown number of people, and lasting for years, potentially continuing for who knows how long, would you get on a dinghy risking your life? It just doesn't make sense, logically speaking. There is testimonial evidence and documentation that show that many of these people are innocent.
The main sources of protection for migrants are the European Convention on Human Rights and the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights. These guarantee basic rights like the right to life, which bans the use of unreasonable force against so-called irregular migrants to prevent them from entering. It also imposes a duty to provide assistance to those in distress at sea.
But how does this work in reality? Unfortunately, despite these protections, migration control by member states and third countries' coast guards often entail human rights violations. And as we discussed, these violations happen out of sight, away from accountability or oversight.
And in the same interview, Ms. Linardi presented a video evidence of the Libyan Coast Guard exercising violence against migrants in the Mediterranean.
The man shouting is an Italian Navy officer aboard a helicopter, begging the Libyan Coast Guard to stop because they are killing someone.
This is a chilling reminder of what happens when these actions take place beyond public view and out of sight. As you could imagine, the externalization of the EU agenda deeply impacts asylum seekers, both physically and psychologically.
And oftentimes, experiencing physical and psychological abuse and trauma is a reality of this journey. And even if they successfully reach Europe at some point, these experiences are not even considered in applications for refugee status.
Often people become vulnerable because of the suffering, the abuse, and the extremely harsh conditions they face and experiences they face during the journey, which is something that has to be considered, because you can leave your country of origin for whatever reason. And what they endure then during the journey, abuse, arbitrary detention, torture, rape, violent extortion, forced labor, slavery, crossing the sea, shipwrecks, it becomes part of their story once they arrive. The focus seems to be on trying to make sure, when it comes to policies, that as many countries as possible are defined safe so that you can deport or repatriate people there, and never focus on establishing alternative routes and looking at what are really the individual reasons pushing people to leave.
The experiences and insights shared by Ms. Linardi revealed that much of the immigration control, like informal agreements and detention practices in transit countries, occurs off-stage, in spaces where transparency is minimal and actions escape public scrutiny, as we like to say, out of sight. These practices and policies systematically ignore vital human rights obligations.
In these hidden spaces, power dynamics are disproportionately skewed, leaving migrants vulnerable to abuse without recourse. That's to say, they're out of rights. This hidden layer of operations raises the question, when will European policies align with our collective responsibility to care for displaced persons, rather than externalizing and outsourcing responsibility to avoid human rights obligations? Thank you for listening. Until next time.